So I want you to just picture this, right? You are gripping the steering wheel of a car.
Okay, yeah.
It's the dead of night, pitch black. And you've been ordered to navigate this really winding, treacherous mountain road.
Which is terrifying on its own.
Right. But, I mean, you're a skilled driver. You know the mechanics of the vehicle. You understand the rules of the road. In broad daylight, this drive wouldn't be an issue at all.
It's not daylight.
Exactly. And here is the massive, terrifying catch. You've been instructed to do this drive completely without headlights.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a disaster.
The road ahead is just pitch black. You have no instruments to, illuminate the hairpin turns, no way to see the cliff edges that are just inches from your tires.
The risk there is just astronomical.
It really is. And the absolute worst part of this entire scenario, if you miss a turn, like you misjudge the darkness, you aren't the one who pays the ultimate price.
Right.
The passenger in the back seat does.
Yeah, and it's just such a chilling scenario to put someone in.
Yeah.
Because you are essentially guaranteeing a disaster,
Totally.
The driver is being completely set up to fail, and the passenger is placed in mortal danger simply because the fundamental tools you need for safe navigation have been stripped away.
Right.
And, I mean, that isn't an individual's failure. That is a profound systemic structural failure.
And that analogy, driving in the dark without headlights, it isn't just a thought experiment. It actually comes directly from the massive stack of sources we are pouring over today.
Yeah, it really sets the stage.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are looking at the hidden, often totally invisible mechanics of medical diagnosis. And we've got an incredibly dense stack of material today.
We really do. Clinical case history straight from the front lines.
Yeah.
Philosophical teardowns of evidence-based medicine.
Right. Academic literature on regulatory capture, and even these formal whistleblower documents submitted to the UK's General Medical Council.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. So our mission today is to completely unpack a quiet but honestly massive structural shift happening in modern healthcare. We are trying to figure out what happens when algorithms, pre-printed checklists, and institutional protocols are used to replace the deeply owned 40-year pattern recognition of an experienced clinician.
Which is really the beating heart of the evidence we're looking at today. We're anchoring this whole discussion on an incredible firsthand account from a veteran practitioner.
Yeah, the sources ask a really profound question, like, can you connect the dots and explain this so that a common human can comprehend it?
And it comes down to a very specific burden that rests on the experienced clinician.
Right.
Think about what happens after 40 years of triage. I mean, observing exactly how illness presents itself in the human body, how it deceives us, how it can be fatal if it's misinterpreted.
You develop a form of pattern recognition.
Exactly. A pattern recognition that absolutely no algorithm can fully replicate, and honestly, no amount of goodwill can replace.
Because you understand that the difference between a safe clinical encounter and a disastrous one is often just a single missed sign.
Just one sign.
Yeah.
A subtle change in color.
Right.
A respiratory rate that is slightly too rapid. A history that, just doesn't quite add up.
And it was this very pattern recognition that put the clinician in our sources in one of the toughest spots of their entire career. At College Road Surgery and the Woking Walking Clinic in the United Kingdom, they collected clinical evidence indicating a systemic issue.
Yeah, patients were receiving independent clinical assessments and treatment advice from nurses who were operating without the structured safety framework necessary for those kinds of decisions.
Well, and wait, before we really get into the weeds here, I need to pause and make something explicitly clear to you, the listener, because accuracy is so crucial here.
Very true.
The sources we are jumping into contain some incredibly charged debates regarding healthcare policy, specifically about the shifting roles of doctors versus nurses and deep systemic failures. I want to state unequivocally that this is not a critique of the nursing profession. Nurses are among the most compassionate, skilled, and brave practitioners in healthcare.
Absolutely.
It is not a comment on any individual. We are impartially reporting the viewpoints, the evidence, and the arguments contained strictly within this original source material. We are not taking sides or endorsing these viewpoints.
Yeah, we're merely conveying the documented ideas. The clinician themselves states this is a statement about a structural failure, one that put patients at risk because the tools to ensure their safety did not yet exist.
Right. And the governance frameworks to enforce those tools had not yet caught up with the reality in practice.
Which brings us right back to that clinical equivalent of asking someone to drive at night without headlights.
Exactly. So to even begin to understand why a clinician's pattern recognition is so crucial and why losing it is so dangerous, we have to look under the hood at how modern medicine actually thinks.
We need to talk about the epistemology of medicine.
Right. Why might a healthcare system entirely built on rigid algorithms be fundamentally flawed from the ground up? And the sources start by attacking something they call the myth of the average patient.
So we have to talk about evidence-based medicine, or EBM. On paper, EBM sounds flawless, right?
I mean, yeah, the conscientious and judicious use of current best evidence.
Exactly. It relies heavily on randomized controlled trials, RCTs, and these massive meta-analyses.
Mhm.
In the scientific community, these sit at the absolute pinnacle of the evidence pyramid.
And I always thought RCTs were the undisputed gold standard. Like you take 10,000 people, randomize them, give half a new drug, give the other half a sugar pill, and you just track the data.
Right. It strips away human bias.
Yeah. It seems like the only logical way to figure out if something actually works.
And it is an incredibly powerful tool for determining broad efficacy. But the sources highlight a massive philosophical and mathematical blind spot when you try to apply that broad tool to a single human being sitting right in an exam room.
Because the trial only shows what works for the average person.
Yes. The results of an RCT show the comparative efficacy of a treatment for an average randomized patient. But here's the problem. An average patient is purely a statistical construct.
They don't actually exist.
They do not exist in reality.
Yeah.
The statistical process actively discards the outliers to find that average mean.
Because statistics are designed to smooth out the weirdness, right? They minimize the extremes.
Exactly. But human biology is incredibly messy. And the sources point out that clinical trials almost never capture what we call soft data. And, soft data is everything at a real clinical encounter.
Okay, soft data. Give me a tangible example of that. Because if I go to the doctor, my blood pressure is hard data, my temperature is hard data. What is the soft data?
Soft data involves the highly distinctive, unquantifiable details unique to you. It's the specific subjective severity of your symptoms. It's the oximetry, which is a term for the rate of growth or the trajectory of your illness over time.
Okay, that makes sense.
It also includes psychosocial factors, your personal preferences, your underlying anxieties, and the highly specific nuances of your history. A mathematical algorithm simply cannot compute soft data.
It can't capture that precise moment of human choice.
Right, the intuition that makes up the essence of medical judgment.
There is a brilliant example of this in the sources from a thinker named Tonelli. He talks about two patients showing up at a hospital with abdominal pain.
Oh, the Tonelli example is the perfect illustration of this epistemological gap. Imagine patient A and patient B.
Okay.
They both walk into the emergency room complaining of severe abdominal pain. The triage nurse takes their history. It's identical. The physical examinations yield identical documented results.
Wow, okay.
They draw blood, and the laboratory data is completely identical. If you feed these two patients into an algorithm, the computer sees the exact same person. The hard data is indistinguishable.
But biologically, they are obviously not the same person.
Not at all. Patient A turns out to have acute appendicitis and requires immediate surgery before it ruptures. Patient B does not have appendicitis. Maybe it's severe indigestion or a minor viral issue.
So how does the doctor know?
Well, Tonelli's point is that there are non-quantifiable differences between these two individuals. An algorithm is completely blind to those differences. But an experienced veteran surgeon, they pick up on the soft data.
Ah, like maybe patient A is guarding their stomach in a slightly different way.
Yes. Or maybe the pallor of their skin suggests a systemic infection. The veteran surgeon detects those invisible clues and makes the right call to operate.
Okay, let's unpack this. If EBM is supposed to be the gold standard, but it only builds guidelines for the average patient, it sounds like you're saying relying strictly on the best data is like trying to tailor a bespoke suit, using only the national average measurements of the entire population.
It's a disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah.
If you tailor a suit based on the national average, you might get incredibly lucky, and it fits a tiny fraction of the population perfectly.
Right.
But for the vast majority, the sleeves will be too long, the shoulders too tight, and for some, it won't even go on.
Humans just aren't standardized commodities.
Exactly. Treating patients like generic commodities on an assembly line actually increases morbidity and mortality.
Yeah.
It actively harms people when you strip away the nuance.
I want to push back on that slightly, though. Like, it's one thing for a doctor to reference an algorithm as a helpful guide, right? Like, hey, the data says try this first. But the sources take it a step further. They talk about unintended consequences when health systems literally mandate algorithmic compliance.
Yes, when a hospital tells a doctor, you must follow this flowchart or you will be penalized.
Right. What happens then?
Well, we see the catastrophic results of that kind of rigid mandate in the sepsis mandate example provided in the texts.
Okay, sepsis. That's a life-threatening reaction to infection, right?
Yeah, it moves fast and it kills fast. So the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, instituted a core measure. They mandated that if a patient presented at the hospital with community-acquired pneumonia, antibiotics had to be administered within 4 hours.
Okay, I have to admit, as a patient, that sounds entirely reasonable. If I have a deadly infection, I want the antibiotics flowing into my veins as fast as humanly possible. 4 hours sounds like a solid safety net.
The logic seems sound, and it was based on retrospective data that suggested earlier treatment led to better outcomes. But here is where the mechanism of the mandate causes the system to buckle.
Why?
When you dictate care based strictly on a ticking clock, you force the practitioner to prioritize the metric over the patient. The mandate caused massive overdiagnosis.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. Why would a time limit cause a doctor to overdiagnose?
Because diagnosing pneumonia isn't always instant. It takes time to observe the patient, run cultures, and see how the illness is progressing, that oximetry we mentioned earlier.
Right, the trajectories.
But if the doctor only has 4 hours to administer the drug or face institutional penalties, they don't have the luxury of time. If a patient comes in with a bad cough and a slight fever, the doctor might not be sure if it's bacterial pneumonia or just a viral bronchitis.
But because the clock is ticking...
Exactly. They pull the trigger. They diagnose pneumonia and pump the patient full of broad-spectrum antibiotics just to be safe and to hit the CMS metric.
Better safe than sorry, right?
Except antibiotics aren't harmless. A massive cross-sectional analysis of almost 100,000 emergency department admissions for pneumonia was later conducted.
Oh, wow. What did they find?
They looked at the actual outcomes of this mandate, and they found absolutely no correlation between the time of the first antibiotic dose and inpatient mortality rates.
Wait, really? So the entire premise of the 4-hour rule was flawed?
Yes. Rushing the antibiotics did not save more lives, but what they did do was subject tens of thousands of patients to massive doses of antibiotics they didn't need.
Which causes huge issues.
It wipes out their gut flora, leaves them vulnerable to secondary infections, and on a macro level, massively accelerates the crisis of antibiotic resistance.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, algorithms prioritize production and speed.
Precisely. As one safety expert in the sources points out, the system relies on codified knowledge rather than the tacit knowledge, a feel for the game that experienced clinicians possess.
The algorithm doesn't allow for observation, it demands action.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've established that these rigid algorithms have massive blind spots. But the sources reveal a structural shift that takes this problem and multiplies it on a national scale. What happens when a healthcare system decides to rely entirely on those blind algorithms to expand its workforce?
This is where we get into the historical policy shift documented in the sources. Around 2006, the United Kingdom was facing a massive recruitment crisis for doctors and spiraling healthcare costs.
Right.
To combat this, the system enacted a major structural change. They granted significantly greater prescribing and diagnosing powers to nurses and pharmacists.
And here's where I want to reiterate our impartiality reminder. This is not a critique of the compassion, skill, or bravery of nurses. They are vital practitioners.
It is a statement about a structural failure.
Right. So explain the regulatory gap here.
Well, think about a medical doctor's training. It is 5 years of medical school, specifically focused on differential diagnosis. After that, they work under intense supervision and have to pass rigorous exams like the PL Lab to prove clinical competence.
It's a massive safety framework.
But the sources argue that nurses were suddenly given independent clinical assessment duties without this structured safety framework, effectively relying solely on algorithms to diagnose.
Wow. It's like taking a highly skilled flight attendant and suddenly asking them to land a commercial jet using only a checklist, without ever putting them in the flight simulator.
That is a perfect analogy. The tools to ensure their safety just didn't exist yet. And the sources link this reliance on algorithms to a broader issue, the rise of managerialism in healthcare.
Managerialism, what does that look like in practice?
The sources argue there has been a gradual shift from caring for the patient to caring for the organization, optimizing performance, hitting targets, cutting costs.
Treating healthcare like a factory.
Exactly. And this leads to the use of pre-printed assessment sheets and algorithmic prompts.
The fill-in-the-blank forms.
Yes. And the sources note that when junior doctors or nurses use these questionnaires, they fail to make eye contact. They fail to build a relationship.
And if you don't look at the patient, you miss the soft data.
Exactly. And they fail to engage their brains to actually analyze the data, leading to horrific delayed diagnoses.
Okay, so the theory of structural failure sounds bad on paper. But what does it look like in a real clinic? We need to transition to the specific evidence collected by the experienced clinician at the College Road Surgery and Walking Clinic.
The clinical case histories provided in the sources are just harrowing.
Let's dive into some of these specific cases, because they really bring this to life. Let's start with a 20-year-old youth.
This one is a classic algorithm failure. A 20-year-old youth went to the walk-in clinic. He was seen by the staff, who used their algorithmic protocols, checked the boxes, and diagnosed him with shingles.
Shingles is a viral infection that causes a rash, right?
Yes, so they treated him for that. But a week later, he came back looking unwell. His behavior was the red flag. He refused to go home.
His soft data was screaming that something was wrong.
Exactly. The receptionist rushed him to the veteran doctor, who took one look at him and instantly diagnosed septic shock.
Wait, septic shock? From shingles?
He never had shingles. He had an undiagnosed Staphylococcus infection in pedigo.
How does an algorithm confuse a viral rash with a deadly bacterial infection?
Because an algorithm sees skin rash plus pain and outputs a common diagnosis. Because the clinic lacked deep differential diagnosis training, they couldn't distinguish the two.
And the cost of that missing pattern recognition was almost his life.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
Let's look at the 12-year-old girl. This one is incredibly heavy.
It is devastating. A 12-year-old girl presented with a blood stain in her underwear. She was seen by a nurse who followed the protocol for a common ailment and treated her for a urine infection.
But wait, did they examine her?
No. She was diagnosed and treated without a clinical examination. And she has 0 symptoms of a UTI. No burning, nothing.
And they ran a urine test, right?
Yes, and the urine test was completely normal.
Then why treat her for a urine infection?
Because the algorithm required an output. Blood and underwear equaled UTI on the checklist.
That is just staggering.
The structural failure meant they missed the real horrific diagnosis. She had suffered sexual abuse and traumatic physical injury.
They were so blinded by the protocol, they missed a massive trauma. Let's move to the patient with the white-colored stool.
Right. She explicitly told the clinic staff about this symptom. Now, white-colored stool is a massive red flag for jaundice or severe liver problems.
Because bile isn't reaching the digestive tract, right?
Yeah, exactly. It is not subtle. But relying on basic protocols for mild discomfort, they advised her to go home and take paracetamol.
Paracetamol, which is highly dangerous for the liver.
Extremely dangerous. And it turned out she wasn't just generally unwell, she had a highly contagious hepatitis infection.
So they completely missed the obvious sign, gave her a dangerous drug, and sent a contagious person back into the community.
Yes, she returned to the waiting room multiple times, exposing everyone.
What's fascinating here is the cascade effect of these errors.
Exactly. When practitioners cannot differentiate between common and potentially serious conditions, they misdiagnose or they panic.
Right. They either send sick people home or rush healthy people to the hospital.
Inflicting massive psychological anxiety on patients and overwhelming the system.
Which leads to the white-collar hypertension story.
Oh, this one perfectly encapsulates the lack of medical knowledge. A patient's high blood pressure was dismissed and documented as white-collar hypertension.
Which is obviously a misunderstanding of white coat hypertension, right? Just being nervous at the doctor's.
Yes. They assumed it was nerves, so they sent her home. She collapsed later and ended up in the ICU with acute kidney failure.
If these errors were so obvious to the experienced clinician, how were the practitioners defending themselves? When confronted, what did they say?
The only way they could defend their actions was to say, "We followed the protocol."
We followed the protocol, just a total abdication of clinical responsibility?
They felt absolved because they checked the right boxes on the form.
If an experienced clinician is witnessing this level of harm, why didn't the system hit the brakes? We need to move from the clinic floor to the boardrooms of regulatory bodies to understand what the sources call organizational silence.
This is where we see the intense burden of the whistleblower. The clinician in our sources desperately attempted to raise the alarm.
What did they do?
They wrote formal letters to the Primary Care Trust Chairwoman, Jane Dale. They raised concerns with Commissioner Sandra Hills and provided a detailed case summary to Nurse Manager Freda Smithers.
So they gave management all the data. Did anything change?
Nothing changed. The clinician even offered to work for free to supervise the walk-in clinic.
Wait, really? Offered to work for free just to provide that pattern recognition?
Yes, and the GMC, the General Medical Council, and the Royal Colleges failed to stop it.
What happened to the clinician?
The retaliation was insidious. Nurses were allegedly logging into the computer system, specifically to find faults in the clinician's notes, a massive breach of patient confidentiality.
That is just pure intimidation.
The clinician was left feeling helpless and sad, and they note they were traumatized not by the disciplinary inquiries, but by watching patients suffer due to substandard care.
But this isn't just one clinic in Woking, right? The sources broaden the lens here.
Yeah, this details a massive culture of organizational silence in healthcare. Hierarchical structures and fear of backlash prevent staff from speaking up.
Like the Stafford Hospital scandal.
Exactly. At mid-stance, an estimated 1,200 patients died needless deaths because of this exact culture of silence.
It's terrifying, but how do regulators fail so completely? The sources use the Vioxx scandal to explain this through the theory of regulatory capture.
Vioxx is the ultimate textbook case. It was a painkiller that caused up to 140,000 heart attacks before it was withdrawn.
When a drug kills that many people, you assume massive corruption, like suitcases of cash to regulators at the MHRA in the UK.
But the sources test theories of regulatory capture at the MHRA, and they found that explicit revolving door corruption was limited.
Then what caused it?
The mechanisms of capture were much more subtle, information overload from the industry, and shared cultural framework.
Information overload. So the pharmaceutical company just buries the regulator in data.
Exactly. They submit so many complex statistical analyses that the regulator becomes utterly dependent on the company's interpretation. They don't have the manpower to independently verify it.
And the shared cultural framework. What does cultural capture mean?
Over decades, regulators and pharma executives adopt the exact same scientific paradigms. In the case of Vioxx, both were absolutely obsessed with gastrointestinal safety.
Because older painkillers cause stomach ulcers.
Right, so they had a massive blind spot for heart issues, and their shared framework dictated that only massive RCTs were valid proof of harm.
So they completely ignored the soft data from frontline doctors warning about heart attacks?
Yes, they dismissed it as mathematically inferior. This cognitive capture resulted in a painfully slow regulatory response.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means that from the local clinic to the national regulator, the systems designed to protect you often prioritize their own preservation and rigid protocols over your safety.
It's incredibly sobering.
But we can't just leave it there. We can't go back to the 1950s where the doctor is unquestioned, but we also can't rely on blind algorithms. How do we synthesize the experienced clinician's pattern recognition with modern healthcare demands?
The sources outline pathways to reclaim safety. And the first is fundamentally empowering the patient.
Tell me about the Choosing Wisely UK initiative.
It actively encourages shared decision-making, or SDM. It prompts patients to ask 3 crucial questions to disrupt the algorithm. Is this test necessary? What are the alternatives? And what if we do nothing?
It forces the practitioner to stop looking at the checklist and look at the human.
Exactly. And the future of this is AI SDM, artificial intelligence-supported shared decision-making.
Where the AI doesn't just hand down a verdict.
Right. The AI is a dialogue partner. The clinician is the deliberation lead, and the patient is an active participant rather than a generic commodity on a conveyor belt.
Okay, but what about the immediate crisis? The walk-in clinics that are overwhelmed right now?
That brings us to the MAI tool, systematizing pattern recognition.
The MAA tool, MAYA, medical advice you access. This was created by the clinician in our sources, right?
Yes. They realized that 8 out of 10 people rushing to emergency clinics didn't actually have anything serious. But the blind algorithms were failing to filter them properly.
So how does MAYA work?
It focuses on 12 common presenting symptoms. But crucially, it doesn't look at symptoms in isolation.
Right, because an algorithm sees headache and immediately thinks brain tumor.
Exactly. MAYA uses a combination of 3 symptoms, color-coded by severity, to differentiate well from unwell.
So it requires 3 interlinked symptoms to trigger an emergency response.
Yes. It prevents overreaction to single symptoms while catching complex patterns.
It's like having the 40-year veteran doctor sitting at the front desk, quickly sorting the patients who just need rest from the ones who are secretly in septic shock, instead of a rigid computer flowchart.
Exactly. MAYA respects the nuance of human biology. It solved the administrative bottleneck. It empowers the patient to stay home when safe.
Which prevents the system from being overwhelmed.
And most importantly, it ensures the veteran clinician actually has the time to use their pattern recognition on the 20% who genuinely need it.
Wow. Okay, we have covered so much ground today. To briefly recap our journey, we started with the irreplaceable value of clinical pattern recognition, that tacit knowledge that sees what algorithms miss.
We looked at the profound dangers of sending practitioners into the dark without headlights via rigid algorithms.
Right, leading to tragedies like we saw in the Woking Walking Clinic. We discussed the systemic silence that protects these failures and the massive weight of the whistleblower's burden.
And finally, we looked at the hope of dynamic, patient-centered tools like MayY.
So, connecting this all back to you, the listener, you are the ultimate advocate for your own body.
Yes, knowing that the system relies heavily on algorithms means you must be incredibly proactive. You have to clearly communicate your unique, soft data to your provider.
You have to force them to look up from the checklist.
Disrupt the flow. Do not be afraid to ask questions.
We've spent all this time talking about how algorithms and protocols are failing to capture the nuance of human illness. But as artificial intelligence rapidly evolves to recognize patterns better than humans ever could, are we about to replace the 40-year veteran clinician, not with a nurse and a checklist, but with a massive neural network? And if we do, who exactly do we hold accountable when the AI misses that single subtle sign?